Hello, welcome, and thanks for joining me. Let's spend a few minutes chatting about creating minds, an anatomy of creativity seen through the lives of Freud, Einstein, Picasso, Stravinsky, Eliot, Graham, and Gandhi by Howard Gardner, which is a book that I fairly recently finished reading and wanted to get a chat up on it before while it was still somewhat fresh in my mind. But yeah, this book was originally published in 1993. It's a work of nonfiction. This edition that I read, this electronic edition, was put out in 2011. So this author, Howard Gardner, apparently is sort of famous for exploring the idea of intelligences or multiple intelligences. Another book of his that I think he's fairly well known for is Frames of Mind, the Theory of Multiple Intelligences. And so what he attempts to do in this book is to look at sort of creative intelligence as it's exhibited through the lives of these different artists and scientists that I mentioned. So, I was really interested to read this because I'm interested in identity and ideas of how the mind works. I had read, a while back, I read a book called The Happiness Hypothesis by Jonathan Haidt, which explored some of these ideas of creativity and the human mind, how we think. And so, I thought this would be really kind of an interesting book to dive into, and it really was. So, yeah, how the book is structured is part one is an introduction, and it sort of sets the framework for why, sort of the book in general. Like, for one, why he chose these particular people, because there could be others, right, that fit his criteria. One thing he was looking for were artists of roughly the same time period. They were contemporaneous with each other, and so they really impacted the 20th century, which was the era that he said he was the most familiar with. And so, he chose these particular artists because they highlighted a different kind of intelligence, which I thought was kind of interesting. So, just again to recap, the chapters of the book. The first chapter is about Freud. So it's sort of a profile of Freud's life, who lived from 1856 to 1939. Then number two was Einstein from 1879 to 1953. Then there was this brief interlude in the book where he sort of recapped what he had already discussed. And then number three was Picasso, who lived between 1881 and 1973. Then Stravinsky, who lived between 1882 and 1971. Number five was T.S. Eliot, who lived from 1888 to 1965. Then there was another interlude where he again recaps sort of what he's been discussing. And then we finish out with number six, Martha Graham, 1894 to 1991. And then number seven, Gandhi, who lived between 1869 and 1948. So again, all these figures lived from the late middle-ish to late 19th century all the way up to, most had passed away by the middle of the 20th century. Martha Graham was the youngest of those profiled, who was born in 1894, and she didn't pass away actually until 1991. But one thing that I thought was really kind of interesting about these creative intelligences is that they're also different, really, in different fields. Freud, the field of psychiatry, he studied the unconscious. Einstein in physics. And then Picasso, the artist, famous artist, Stravinsky in music, T.S. Eliot in poetry, and Martha Graham in modern dance. And Gandhi was, of course, political movements. So creative in in these different avenues. And so I thought that was really kind of an interesting mix, because what the author did then was sort of look at a profile of these lives and then get an idea of where they were similar and what sort of similar aspects there were, maybe to their background or to their personalities, that led to creativity. Another thing the author really mentions is creativity. This is not like creative in, you arranged your room in kind of a creative way. He's talking about creative figures who really changed their fields of endeavor. So he calls it a language. They changed the language, for example, of poetry, or changed the language of psychiatry, or changed the language of art. With Picasso, Gandhi, changed the language of political movements. However, he does make the point, and we see illustrated through the sort of the studies of these lives, that they didn't act alone and it didn't come out of a vacuum. So they all had predecessors, and there were other folks working in the same areas during their lifetimes that their work was built upon. For example, Gandhi was heavily influenced by Tolstoy, Leo Tolstoy, the writer, who had similar nonviolent ideas. And so, the author illustrates this really well through these different profiles of the different characters. Another kind of interesting thing to me was the kind of the running theme through all of these lives was how childish they all were. They sort of kept childish, not in an insulting sense, but childish meaning they kept a childlike view of their field, of the world. So it was always sort of with a sense of wonder and like anything's possible. And so, I thought that was really interesting that each of these characters really sort of kept that through their lives. Another sort of interesting thing was how difficult people they were to deal with. Some of them dealt with, large groups, like Stravinsky, who was a orchestral music, so had to work with big like musicians and it took a lot of people to produce his works, and he had to work with them, but on an individual level, he was very difficult to be around. Same thing with Gandhi, who inspired millions of people, but on a personal level, like with his own wife and children, he was very aloof from them, and so, sort of a difficult person to actually interact with on a one-on-one, but in sort of the macro, when they were in their field, they really, that's where they really had a chance to shine. I was really interested, I think of all the profiles that were in the book, I think the most interesting to me was Martha Graham. Perhaps it's because I knew the least about her going into this, so it was really interesting to me that modern dance as we know it today, like in music videos, and we see it everywhere today. Every really mid-sized town or city has a modern dance school, where young people can go and be taught dance. But back in the early 20th century, this did not exist yet. There were really just the classical forms of dance. There were some stirrings, like, for example, Isadora Duncan in modern dance, but Martha Graham really took that to a whole new level and really sent it mainstream. And to me, that was really super interesting. Another sort of aspect of her that really illustrates with the rest of the group as well, the rest of the lives that were profiled, were how originally their ideas, they're all these people came up with something really new. In their fields of endeavor. And just to take the case of Martha Graham, modern dance, she had to win over audiences. So when she had modern dance, the first modern dances that were done, dance dramas that were done to audiences, say in LA or New York, the audience didn't understand them. So they didn't know how to relate to them. So the mass kind of people didn't quite get it just yet, but the critics did. The people who were, educated in the field, understood what was going on, and so they sort of supported her, and then eventually, the audiences came around because we all moved forward with this in this sense. And the same thing really with the rest of the artists too. I think Freud, first book that came out, only sold a handful of copies. He was not a success at first because at first I think when these new ideas are being sent out into the world that the general people don't understand the language yet, and it takes a while for that to happen. And so one thing that all of these artists and all these creatives had in common was just keep pushing through. They did not accept defeat. They all suffered many defeats and many failures, but they did not stop at all. And I will read a quote in here in a bit that I think is really interesting about this sort of creative aspect. But another kind of interesting thing to me was about how they were all kind of outsiders in one way or another. Many of these artists and scientists profiled were from the middle class, but to go and do something different, like their parents may have a different life in mind for them, but yet they want to strike out in something really risky and unknown, and that's what they do in a lot of cases, like Martha Graham, for example. Again, I think one reason why her story was so compelling to me was not only did she invent a new sort of art form in dance, or took dance, at least American dance, to a completely different level, but she did this as a woman, so she had to fight those forces at the time that would have sort of silenced her voice or diminished her voice. So I thought, that's really cool, like outsiders, and to take the risk to leave what in many cases could have been a completely comfortable middle-class life that they would have had in front of them had they stayed with their family. T.S. Eliot was another one who was born in a really prosperous family in St. Louis and moved to England to be a poet, really risky endeavor at the time. Of course, none of his fame had happened yet, so none of it was actually set in stone that it was going to happen. So I thought that was really kind of interesting. And then before I run out of time, I just wanted to read a quote from the book that lists let's see, three different aspects of these creative people that the author says he learned when he was doing the research. These are three things that he learned doing the research. Number one, creative individuals spend a considerable amount of time reflecting on what they are trying to accomplish, whether or not they are achieving success, and if not, what they might do differently. So all of these creatives were very focused in their areas of endeavor, and they tried different things. Some things worked, some things didn't work, but they had a direction that they wanted to go in, and they refused to stop going in that direction, and they all ultimately did succeed, of course. Number two, creative individuals leverage their strengths. They determine their strongest area and build their achievements around these potent intelligences. They do not worry about what they do not do well. They can always get help from others and perhaps barter their areas of strength with those who have complementary skills. So they focus on what they can do. They focus on what they know, and then other aspects they try to get other people to do or leave to other people. Another instance of Martha Graham, for example, who she established a dance company, but she wasn't real good about running the dance company as far as the money aspect and the organization and management of it. She was really the creative aspect of it, but others did that part, for her. And then number three, creative individuals frame their experiences. Such people are highly ambitious and they do not always succeed by any means. But when they fail, they do not waste much time lamenting, blaming, or at the extreme quitting. Instead, regarding the failure as a learning experience, they try to build upon its lessons in their future endeavors. So yeah, all of these creative people failed at one point or at several points, and they just kept on trucking. They were committed to their areas of endeavor, and that's what they stuck with. So yeah, I'm about out of time, so I think I will stop the chat with that. It was really interesting for me to read about these creative people and these sort of different aspects that they all shared in common. Some of them weren't very likable people. Actually, many of these weren't really likable people on kind of a one-to-one level, but they all did great things. So good reading in that sense. So I have finished The Doomed City by the Strugatsky brothers, which is Soviet-era science fiction. So this will be the next book chat that I have coming up. I have finished this book already, so hope to get a chat up on this very soon. So until next time, take care. Bye.